Check this out, BCM Raider here, bringing you another Commander deck tech. Today, we're looking at Delina, Wild Mage. This is another mono red build, but this is following the theme of what's considered big red. So, what makes Delina very special is the fact we get to include the aspect of rolling dice, and we're going to be doing many fun, very large mono red things, such as creating lots of mana, dealing as much damage as we can to all of our opponents as possible, and taking multiple combat steps. Just overall, the major big red things that we could possibly do. So, what Delina Wild Mage actually does is whenever Delina Wild Mage attacks, we get to choose target creature we control. Then we get to roll a d20. If the result of the roll is 1 through 14, we get to create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary and we have to exile that creature at the end of combat. However, if we roll 15 through 20, much higher rolls, we get to create one of those tokens and then we get to roll again. So we're going to play into focusing on trying to beat our odds by rolling much higher all the time. And we have lots of things that are going to help us with that. So let's get right into it. First up, we have a whole bunch of really cool planeswalkers that are going to help us out. We have Kotha the Hammer. This is a 4-drop red planeswalker. It'll enter with 3 loyalty on it. His +1 ability, we get to untap a target mountain. That mountain will become a 4/4 elemental creature. Or we can -2 him, and we can add 1 red mana for each mountain we control. Luckily, we have a very specialized mana base, which I'll get to a little later. But if we -5, we get an emblem where mountains have a activated ability of dealing 1 damage to any target. And that's going to be really fun. Now we have a personal favorite of mine. We have Chandra, Torch of Defiance. This is another 4-drop planeswalker. It'll enter with 4 loyalty. We can +1 her to exile the top card of our library, and we can play that card that turn. But if we don't, we can just exile it and deal 2 damage to each opponent. Or we can +1 her and add 2 red mana. That'll help us cast bigger spells. And if there's a creature we need to deal with, we can -3 her to deal 4 damage to that creature. Or -7, my personal favorite. Whenever we cast any spell, we get to deal 5 damage to any target. Now we have the bigger Chandra. Chandra, Awakened Inferno. This is a very powerful planeswalker. This spell can't be countered at all. It'll enter with 6 loyalty counters. We're going to +2 her, and each opponent will get an emblem where they take 1 damage every single upkeep. Or -3, we can deal 3 damage to each non-elemental creature. Or we can spot removal something by removing as many loyalty counters as we want to either target creature or planeswalker. And if that permanent would be put into a graveyard, it gets exiled instead. Now we have a fun one. We have Chandra, Flameshaper. This is a 7-cost planeswalker. It'll enter with 6 loyalty, but her +2, we get to add 3 red mana, and then we exile the top 3 cards of our library. We can play that card this turn, or we can +1. We can create a token of target creature we control. It'll gain haste. Unfortunately, we have to sacrifice that token. Or -4, we can deal 8 damage divided how we choose among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers. Okay, let's get into the creatures. We have Will, Blade of the Frontiers. This one's fun. He has a static ability where if we would roll 1 or more dice, we would roll that many dice +1, and then we get to ignore the lowest roll. So that's going to really benefit us with Delina because that means we're going to create that token of the creature during combat, and then we get to roll again. But it's always going to be a higher roll. So chances are we're going to create this loop of rolling many, many times. But whenever we roll one or more dice, we get to put a +1 counter on will. Now we have Combat Celebrant. This one's really fun. If it hasn't been exerted, we get to untap all other creatures we control, and there's a additional combat. So if we're rolling with Delina and making copies, we can just make copies of Combat Celebrant, which will give us basically infinite combat steps. Now we have Felden of the Third Path. He's going to allow us to put a token that's a copy of any creature that's in our graveyard, except it'll be an artifact in addition to its other types, and we have to sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. And because we like creatures that will push as much damage as we need them to, we have Torbrand, Thane of Redfell. This one is very powerful. If a red source we control will deal damage to an opponent or permanent that opponent controls, it'll deal that much damage and then +2. And because we're going to have lots of creatures entering the battlefield, we have Perforos, God of the Forge. This is a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature. It's indestructible, but it won't be a creature unless our devotion is 5 or greater. But whenever any creature enters the battlefield under our control, Perforos is going to deal 2 damage to each opponent. It also has a activated ability where we can pump all of our creatures by 1. And to continually double damage, we have Sulfim, Mayhem Dominus. This is a 5/4 legendary Phyrexian. If a source we control will deal non-combat damage to a opponent or a permanent that opponent controls, it'll deal double that damage instead. And it has a activated ability where we can discard 2 cards and we can make Sulfim indestructible. Now we have Enduring Courage. This is going to trigger whenever another creature enters the battlefield. It'll get +2/+0 in haste. And if Enduring Courage would be put into a graveyard, it gets returned back to the battlefield as a enchantment. Now we have good old Fanatic of Mogus. When this enters, it'll deal damage to each opponent equal to our devotion to red. Luckily, most of our red permanents have a lot of red pips, so we're going to be throwing around a lot of damage just with this guy alone. Now we have a personal favorite of mine. We have Orthorion, Hero of Lavabrink. I play this in Obeka because it's so efficient at making token copies of whatever creature I want. Its first activated ability, we get to create a token that's a copy of another creature we control. It'll gain haste, and unfortunately we can only activate this as a sorcery, but if we have enough mana, such as 9 mana, we get to create 5 tokens rather than just 1. Now we have something to deal with our opponents. We have Sunspine Lynx. Players can't gain life, damage can't be prevented. That's a pretty powerful static effect, and whenever Sunspine Lynx enters the battlefield, it'll deal damage to each player equal to the number of non-basic lands they control. Now we have Karlach, Fury of Avernus. Whenever we attack, if it's the first combat phase, we get to untap all attacking creatures. They gain first strike, and there's a additional combat. This is another creature that will go infinite with Delina. Now for all the modern players, they should be no stranger to Fury. Fury is a 3/3 double striking elemental incarnation. When it enters the battlefield, it'll deal 4 damage divided among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers. It does cost 5 mana, but if we exile a red card from our hand, we can play Fury for its evoke cost. Now we have Port Razor. This has a lot of words on it, but when Port Razor deals combat damage to a player, we get to untap each creature we control, and there's a additional combat. However, Port Razor can't attack a player already attacked that turn. Now we have the good old Terror of the Peaks. This is very scary because we're going to be putting a whole bunch of token creatures, of very large creatures, and whenever any creature enters the battlefield under our control, Terror of the Peaks will deal damage equal to that creature's power to any target. And to continually push even more damage, we have Twin Flame Tyrant. If a source we control would deal damage to a opponent or a permanent that opponent controls, it'll deal double that damage instead. And of course, we have Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker, because we love making token copies of very insane creatures that deal as much damage as possible. And what better creature to copy than Zealous Conscripts? This will enter the battlefield, and then it gains control of target permanent. That permanent will gain haste. But we're going to make infinite Zealous Conscripts by making a token copy of it with Kiki Jiki, which will untap Kiki Jiki, thus making another token copy of Zealous Conscripts. And we're going to repeat this process 100 million times. Now we have Ancient Copper Dragon. This is a very scary dragon. When Ancient Copper Dragon deals combat damage to a player, we get to roll a d20, and then we get to make treasure tokens equal to what we rolled. And to ensure that we have even more combat steps, we have Morog, Fury of Akum. This is a 6/6 Minotaur. Each creature will get +1/+0 each time Morog attacked, but it has landfall. So whenever a land enters the battlefield, if it's our main phase, we get to have a additional combat phase. Now we have Earth Cult Elemental. This is a 6/6 with, when it enters the battlefield, we get to roll a d20. Each player, if it's 1 through 9, will have to sacrifice a permanent. This is the effect of a very old red card called Crack the Earth. But if it's 10 through 19, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. And if we roll a 20, each opponent will have to sacrifice 2 permanents. Now we have Red Dragon. When Red Dragon enters the battlefield, it'll deal 4 damage to each opponent. This is going to be a very good target to make lots and lots of token copies of. Now we have Godo, Bandit Warlord. This is going to be very fun because when it enters the battlefield, we get to search for a very specific equipment that will give us a additional combat phase. And of course, we have a Chroma, Angel of Fury. This spell can't be countered. It has flying, trample, protection from blue and white, and has fire breathing. For 1 red, we can give it +1/+0. It also has morph. Now we have some colorless creatures that we're going to use to really help us out. Of course, we have Sad Robot. Don't really need to say too much about this. It's Solemn Simulacrum. When it enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and when it's put into a graveyard, we get to draw a card. So we have Duplicant. Duplicant is very fun to make copies of because when it enters, we get to exile a creature. So this does a very good job at exiling your opponent's creatures. And then Duplicant will become an exact copy of that exile creature. And of course, we have Wormcoil Engine, because who doesn't love having numerous Wormcoil engines? This is a very efficient creature. It's a 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink, and then if it's put into a graveyard, it splits and becomes 2 separate tokens. One is Lifelink, one is Death Touch. And of course, we have Blightsteel Colossus. Basically, if this thing hits you, you lose the game. It's an 11/11 trample with infect and is indestructible. And if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, we get to shuffle it back in. And of course, we have Triplicate Titan. Very similar to Wormcoil Engine, except it's a 9/9 with flying, vigilance, and trample. And if it would be put into a graveyard, we create 3 tokens with 1 flying, 1 vigilance, and 1 trample. Okay, let's get into the enchantments. First up is Barbarian class. If we roll 1 or more dice, we roll that many dice plus 1, and we get to ignore the lowest roll. Then we can pay a colorless and a red to go to level 2. Whenever we roll 1 or more dice, target creature will get +2/+0 and menace until the end of turn. And then level 3, creatures we control have haste. That is a very, very important level. And of course, because we have so many creatures entering the battlefield, we have impact tremors. We're going to get all these triggers just by creatures entering the battlefield. And impact tremors is the lowest mana cost of all these effects. For all those very greedy players who like playing multiple colors, we have Blood Moon. This is a very cool printing of Blood Moon, but all non-basic lands are now mountains. Now we have a very powerful enchantment. This one is a saga. This is Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It'll enter with Chapter 1, and Chapter 1's effect, we create a 2/2 Goblin Shaman with whenever that token attacks, we create a treasure token. Then Chapter 2, after our draw step, we can discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many. But more importantly is Chapter 3. It'll exile itself and then return back to the battlefield transformed. And it'll transform into Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. It'll become a 2/2 creature with Kiki-Jiki's original ability of creating a token copy of a non-legendary creature. It'll gain haste, and we sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. And just to make sure we keep dealing as much damage as possible, we have Furnace of Wrath. This will double all damage that every player deals, so keep that in mind. Now we have Aggravated Assault. We can pay 5, and then we get a additional combat phase. Now we have Flame Shadow Conjuring. This one is very fun. This has a static effect whenever any non-token creature enters the battlefield. If they do, we can pay 1 red, and we can create a token copy of it that will gain haste, and we have to exile it at the beginning of the next end step. This is a good way for very large creatures to enter the battlefield, have a whole bunch of triggers, and continually make token copies of it. Now we have Dictate of the Twin Gods. This will double all damage, but it has flash, so we can cast it as an instant. Now we have Echoing Assault. This has a static effect where our creature tokens will have menace, so they're going to be very hard to block. But whenever we attack a player, we get to choose a target non-token creature attacking that player, and then we get to create another token copy of that creature, except it'll be a 1/1, but it will enter tapped and attacking that player. But we do get to sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. And of course, we have Fiery Emancipation. All sources of damage that would be dealt to a permanent or player is tripled. So there's a lot of math involved with this deck, but we're not going to worry too much about that. Okay, let's get into the artifacts. First up, we have our Soul Ring. This is a very fancy one. I don't know, but it's Soul Ring. We have Ruby Medallion. This will lower the mana cost of all the red spells we play. Now we have Altar of Dementia. This is going to be very, very beneficial for us because when we make all these tokens that get sacrificed at the end of turn anyway, might as well just sack them off and force your opponents to mill. This will also break up the loop between Delina, Wild Mage, and Karlach. Because once Karlach starts creating these additional combat phases, there's no priority to break this up unless we sacrifice the Karlach that's continually making those copies every single turn. Now we have Strionic Resonator. We're going to use Strionic Resonator to copy the triggered abilities every single time. Now we have Blade of Selves. This is going to allow the equipped creature to have Myriad. So whenever the equipped creature attacks, for each opponent, it's going to create a token copy that's attacking that player or planeswalker as well. Now we have Cloud Key. This is going to give us even more reduction in mana cost just by choosing artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery when Cloud Key enters the battlefield. Now we have a very special one. We have Extraplanar Lens. When this enters, we have to exile a land, but whenever a land we control is tapped for mana, it's going to provide a additional mana. But what makes this unique is the fact that all our basic lands are snow covered. That way we can produce as much red mana as possible. Now we have a fun one. We have Mirror Box. Mirror Box is here to deal with the legend rule because most of our very impactful creatures are legendary. And if we're going to be making token copies of them, why not make sure we don't have to sacrifice the legend? Now we have Panharmonicon. This is going to double the trigger of any permanent entering the battlefield. Now we have Minion Reflector. This is going to allow us to create even more token copies of non-token creatures that enter the battlefield just by paying 2 colorless mana. Now we have the Deck of Many Things. This is a very strange artifact. We do get to roll dice, but for 2 colorless, we get to roll a d20. Then we subtract the number of cards in our hand. If the result is 1 through 9, we get to return a card at random from our graveyard back to our hand. If it's 10 through 19, we get to draw 2 cards. And then if we roll a 20, we get to put a creature card from any graveyard on the battlefield under our control. And when that creature is put into a graveyard, its owner loses the game. Because we have so many things that are going to improve our odds with rolling dice, this actually comes up a lot more than you think. And, of course, we have Helm of the Host. This will create a token copy of the equipped creature, but it isn't legendary. This is the equipment that Godo Bandit Warlord is going to go and search our library for, which will create another non-legendary token copy of itself. That way it produces infinite combat steps. I'm starting to see a theme here. We only have 2 instants in the entire deck. So we have Deflecting Swat. We can choose new targets for a target spell or ability, whether it be a counter spell, stuff like that. It does cost 3 mana, but if we control Delina, we can cast Deflecting Swat without paying its mana cost. Now we have Chaos Warp. We can use this in a couple different ways. We can use Chaos Warp to deal with a opponent's very problematic permanent, or we can target one of our own things to hopefully kind of gamble for something better. Okay, let's get into the sorceries. Since we like gambling, we're playing Gamble. We get to search our library for any card. We get to put that card into our hand. Then we shuffle. Then we have to discard a card at random. But that's what makes it fun. And to deal with all of our opponent's artifacts, we have Vandal Blast. For 1 red, we can destroy target artifacts we don't control, or if we pay its overload cost, we get to destroy all artifacts we don't control. And of course, we are playing Jessica's Will. This one is very powerful. If we control our commander, we get to choose both of these modes, but otherwise, we can add 1 red mana for each card in target opponent's hand, or we exile the top 3 cards, and we can play those cards this turn. Now we have Relentless Assault. We get to untap all creatures that attack this turn, and there's a additional combat phase. Similar to that, there's Seize the Day. There's a additional combat phase, but we get to untap a target creature. This also has flashback. Instead of all the creatures untapping, this is just one single target. And we have Mana Geyser. This is going to produce a lot of red mana for us, equal to the number of tap lands our opponents control. Now we got a fun one. We have World at War. This will give us a additional combat phase, but it also has rebound. So our next turn, we get to cast World at War again without paying its mana cost. Let's get into the land base. This is a very straightforward land base. So we have Arid Mesa, Scalding Tarn, Fabled Passage, Myriad Landscape. These are all going to help us search our library for our mountains. And what are we going to do with all these mountains? We're going to play Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. This is going to enter tapped, but if we control at least 5 other mountains, any mountain past that, Valakut will deal 3 damage to any target. Now we got a fun one. We have Arena of Glory. This will enter tapped unless we control a mountain, but it has a activated ability where we're going to add 2 red mana, but we can only use that mana to cast creature spells, and that creature will gain haste, but Arena of Glory will be exerted, so the next turn it won't untap. Now we have Shinka the Bloodsoaked Keep. This has a activated ability where we can give any legendary creature first strike. So in combat, our creatures are going to deal our damage first. And it's normally going to be a lot more damage than our opponent's creatures. And if we have a lot of creatures out, we have Castle Embreth. For 3 mana, we can give all of our creatures +1/+0 until the end of turn. Most of our permanents have a lot of red pips. We have Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. This will provide a lot of red mana for us, equal to our devotion. And because we're playing a lot of legendaries, we have Plaza of Heroes. This will add basically a red mana, but it'll give us the option of exiling Plaza of Heroes to protect one of those legendaries by giving it hexproof and indestructible. Now we have Hall of the Bandit Lord. This will add a colorless mana, but we can pay 3 life, and if we use that colorless mana on a creature spell, that creature will gain haste. And to ensure that that creature will deal as much damage as possible, why not make it unblockable with Rogue's Passage? And to give us a hedge against our opponent's creatures, we have Mazavith. This will protect us from our opponent's attacking creatures. You can also do a very fun thing where if you declare your creature as an attacker, you can get the attack trigger and then you can Maze of Ith it to untap it. Now we have scrying cheats. This is specifically a snowland, but we can pay a colorless and one snow mana, and we get to look at the top card. If it's a snow card, we get to put that into our hand. And we are running a lot of snow covered mountains for that specific reason. And that was the Commander deck tech for Delina Wild Mage. I really hope you guys enjoyed this very fun take on Big Red. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.